Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, how's it going? And if you are a returning subscriber, hey, how's it going? Hope you're having an amazing day. See what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button. Join us as we change the world. I am here with Linda Treviño. She is a distinguished professor of organizational behavior and ethics at the Smeal College of Business at Penn State. I've seen one of your talks. I was totally nerding out, listening to all the things you were talking about, and I just knew that you would be a phenomenal guest, and we could spend a little time together diving into your background and how you kind of see the world. How's it going today, Linda?
Going great. Sun is out. It's, I think, in the 50s in Pennsylvania, so that's good.
Wow, that's almost summer weather in Pennsylvania. Do you think this is the last? You think this is the last cold snap that you think that's behind you now, or what?
I think it might be the last snowstorm. We had one on Saturday.
Wow. Well, it's we're getting towards spring when those last snows don't stick around too long, right?
I don't know where you are, Nick.
I'm in Charlotte.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in Charlotte, if they even hear that snow may be coming, the whole city shuts down. People are filling their bathtubs up with water. They're pulling all the milk off the shelves in the grocery store. Everyone's ready for Armageddon every time.
I lived in North Carolina for 9 years. So.
Oh, you did? Okay. So you know what I'm coming from. So anyways, let's start talking about your specialty. I love the study of organizational behavior. I love ethics and the intersection of those two things. What is kind of your most exciting topic right now? What's really top of mind? What's getting you excited in your current day-to-day?
Yeah, so a couple of things, but probably the biggest one is one that I've been focusing on for a few years with a former doctoral student of mine, and that is what we're calling ethical voice. So people speaking up in the organization about ethical issues, which is something that I think keeps a lot of ethics and compliance officers up at night. They know that employees know what's going on.
Yep.
And they want them to share that. They have hotlines and other, kinds of processes available. And we know that a lot of the time people don't. Now, we're actually focused, a lot of people have looked at, what influences people to speak up and not. So we kind of know that. But what we were interested in is if people do, then what happens?
Right.
So consequences of ethical voice. And we're finding some really interesting things.
What are you finding?
Well, for one thing, so one study we did, we just looked at speaking up in the context of a work group and, with not so much to a supervisor, but in the context of a work group to try to shift the direction of decision making. And what we found was that one could do that. The decision making did move in an ethical direction by raising ethical awareness in the group. So a lot of times when you're talking about a business decision, people aren't thinking ethics. They're thinking business.
Yeah.
They're thinking business, right? But if you start using ethical language and you sort of shift the conversation a bit, you can raise people's ethical awareness and have them thinking about it in different terms. And then we also found that the way you present your case matters. So if you present it in a way that shows some concern and empathy for, let's say, consumers who might be harmed, that works better than to be morally outraged and show, anger. People have a reaction, negative reaction to that, defensive reaction to that. So the other thing is that what we found was that figuring out a way to make this probably is a no-brainer, but figuring out a way to make the business case for the ethical outcome. So, gee, if we do it the way you want to do it, then, what could happen to our reputation if we did it that way, versus what if we thought about, changing our product this way and selling it as a premium or organic or whatever, kind of product it is. That could actually differentiate us from our competitors, so you can make the business case for the ethical argument, and that seems to help.
So what you're saying is that marrying the sort of business case to the ethical sort of argument is relatively more persuasive in the sort of business realm.
Yeah, and it's not either or. What we found, so we actually used, in this particular study, we used student groups. They were in entrepreneurship classes, and they're used to working with cases and making decisions. And we video recorded all of their interactions, and then we're able to analyze those interactions. Yeah, it was really one of the most fun things I've ever done, was to watch those videos. But seeing how they, work their way through these discussions, and we also found that if somebody wanted to make that just straight bottom line decision that was going to make them the most money and not worry about the ethics at all, then they were more likely to engage in a process we refer to as moral disengagement. They used moral disengagement mechanisms so instead of having their moral awareness raised, they were saying, well, it's really up to the, it was sort of buyer beware. It's really up to the customers. It's their problem, if they're not paying attention, and it's not our responsibility. It's somebody else's responsibility to worry about that. And so there are 8 of these moral disengagement mechanisms that we know about, and we were finding lots of examples in the groups that made the less ethical decisions. We found lots of evidence of moral disengagement, which suggests to me that if you could train people to be on the lookout for those, when somebody says this, red flag should go up, that it's kind of wait a minute, let's think about what we're doing here.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that there are implications for how you could train people to raise ethical awareness, try to avoid moral disengagement mechanisms, have people be aware of them so that they're not buying those kinds of arguments. And that, of course, is assuming that the organization wants people to make the ethical decision, right?
Yeah, which sometimes is a big leap, depending on the organization or the leadership on an actuality basis. Yeah.
So one other cool finding in a different study that we just recently published is that when people observe somebody who steps up and makes the ethical case, they feel something that we refer to as moral elevation.
What is that?
And that is an emotional feeling. So if you think back to a time when you saw somebody do something awesome, it makes me think, CNN used to do, I don't know if they're still doing this, once a year they do these awards for people who are incredibly philanthropic or, and they'd tell their stories and they'd call them up, and you watch it and you're just like, oh my God, I wish I were like that person. That's an amazing person. And
it like
so,
reestablishes your like hope in humanity or something.
Yeah. And, what I sometimes tell my students is that, sometimes you think you're the only one sitting in the room who has this thought, but actually you're probably not. And if you have the courage to say it, other people might actually support you if they feel like they can. And even if they can't support you, they might feel that they really admire you and respect you for what you just did or said. And that's what we found. We found that more than we expected. And we found less threat than we expected. So that was really interesting.
What does that mean?
As well.
Less threat than we expected.
Well, if somebody speaks up, let's say in a work unit, and it could be perceived as threatening, right? Because first of all, you're speaking up about something that I didn't, that I also knew about, right? So does that threaten my sort of sense of myself as a moral being? Or it could be something that the group had decided to do. And so, and you're raising an issue about it. Or it could be that the group actually depends on doing this unethical thing in order to make their numbers, or, so there are lots of reasons why ethical voice could be threatening to a person or a group.
So that's actually a huge point, right? Because this is kind of relates in my mind to that logical fallacy of loss aversion, where the fear of loss is greater than the desire for gain, right? So our perception of a loss is greater than the perception for the gain based on how it's framed, or even, there's a ton of great research on that loss aversion. It's almost like there's this sort of like threat aversion, and there's an inherent, if what you're saying is true, then there's sort of an inherent miscalculation of the actual threat that's maybe preventing the moral behavior from coming forward, which is a really interesting problem to solve, because it actually could like open up the floodgates for,
right.
I think a lot of folks, so I love this. This is so interesting. I think a lot of folks feel like they're, Sisyphus pushing this moral rock up the hill. But if what you're saying is true, we're actually a lot closer to getting these moral workplaces that we all really want. If in fact, the moral elevation is there that we can get some inspiration from, the threat is less than what we think. And there's presumably a lot more people who are probably thinking what we're thinking, right? A lot of people probably see the same wrongdoing, and they're not necessarily like, oh, well, no big deal. They maybe just don't have the courage to step forward. And if that threat can be reduced by maybe, helping folks, elevate their, moral awareness, as you said, or helping them to identify these 8 sort of moral disengagement mechanisms, we can probably get sort of some logarithmic uptick in the morality of our workplaces. It's probably just not a linear thing, which I think a lot of people think, or maybe a reverse parabolic thing, which a lot of people think.
I don't know if I'm, ready to jump to that conclusion, but
well, I will.
More research is always required.
Of course.
That's what we have to say. But anyway, I've been doing this research with a woman named Angier Chen, who's at National University of Singapore now, former doctoral student of mine. And so we're having a lot of fun with it. And I think it's really important work that we hope to continue. Yeah. So that's one of the things that has me jazzed these days.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I'm just really zeroing in on that, like that calculation of the threat.
Right.
And I'd love for you.
I mean, that was surprising to us too. I mean, we're looking at consequences, and if you look at the whistleblowing literature, it's all about negative outcomes, retaliation.
Totally.
But a lot of the whistleblowing literature is focused on, reporting outside the organization, right, to the news media or the government, it's all kind of mixed together in there. And so you can't tease it apart because of the way the research was done. So we're looking at internal reporting only. We're not looking at, we're looking at, inside the organization, which is where most of this happens. And kind of leaving out, we're doing a review of the literature right now, and we're leaving out the external only kinds of studies because they're just different.
Yeah, and they could be sort of characteristically different.
Yeah, and they're threatening in a different way.
Totally.
They threaten the whole organization potentially. So,
and I guess if those are sort of overweighted in the sort of scope of the research, and the conclusions from that external based like data set or population ends up informing how we view internal, we could be losing a lot of opportunity to drive forward the change that we think is, or we hope is possible. Right. It's basically a type 1 error on those conclusions. It's pretty crazy.
We'd have to, even with these findings, have to convince employees that the consequences are not as dire as they think. Yeah. Because the other thing that happens is that there's a really famous, one of my favorite articles of all time from social psychology called "Bad is Stronger Than Good" is the title. I don't know if you've seen that one, but basically what he does, what they do is they review all the literature showing that negative information has more of an impact on us than positive information. It's similar to what you were talking about.
Yeah, loss aversion kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, from a ethics and compliance management perspective, if people hear one story about something bad that happened as a result of someone speaking up, that can become an urban legend that lives on, and you might as well forget about convincing people that it's going to be safe for them. So, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge because at the base level, before any action is taken in the real world, there's some internal system that needs to be turned on, right? So we're dealing with like the hearts and minds and feelings of the individuals within our workplace. And for them to sort of be turned on as this sensor of risk or sensor of immorality or whatever you want to call it, they have to feel comfortable enough to do it. And there's so many things, so many stories, fables, rumors, urban legends, whatever you want to call them, in addition to maybe their own sort of workplace trauma, quote unquote, or baggage that they've brought or seen firsthand that really prevents them. It kind of does feel, from a practitioner standpoint or from somebody who's actually in the trenches fighting the ethics and compliance game, that it's like a losing battle. Like, how do I actually get these people to overcome this fear that presumably we all want, right? Like who doesn't want an ethical workplace? All else equal, you know what I'm saying?
I think, the one way that comes to my mind that I would try is to find the positive outcome stories. So find this, do the version of the CNN awards, right? Where people who have spoken up, who did accomplish their goal, are rewarded in some, not, necessarily compensated for it, but recognized and, praised and, have it become part of the legends of the organization.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on. We learn through stories. There's so much there. It's a much more efficient way to convey a principle than it is to read a recipe or something, right? And when we sometimes engage with clients who want to do a speak up campaign or want to do a communication campaign to help really kind of get at the base foundation of their culture, how can we actually start to crowdsource risk management? So it's not just one person blocking all the shots like a goalie in a soccer game. We always talk about that, like your culture is as much about what you reject as it is about what you celebrate. And if you're not celebrating, you have nothing on this side of the balance. You're not showing the full dimension of like, hey, like remember those old comics of like Goofus and Gallant or whatever. You know what I'm talking about? Where I think they were old, like, I forget what it's from. Maybe it's from Highlights or something. But they would be comics of Gallant, who was like the good kid, and they'd be showing an example of that good kid using manners. And then they would show Goofus, who was like the bad kid, the bad example, right? And his feet would be on the counter, or he wouldn't be saying thank you for his gifts. And there was like hundreds of these comics, right? These are like, these are very old. But if you're just, to your point, just doing the, bad is stronger than good approach of just talking about the negative or just leading with the stick, you're not engaging both sides of the brain, for lack of a better term. You know what I'm saying? And you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table, and you're kind of end up kind of reinforcing this thing, because people can be motivated, I think, by a fear, or they can be motivated by sort of something more positive. And if we're engaging that sort of, what did you call it? That moral elevation, that could probably be a stronger driver over the long term, especially if that moral threat is sort of reduced or eliminated or sort of more accurately conveyed to folks. That can be a self-fulfilling mechanism inside of an organizational culture.
So I don't know if if the numbers would work with, in our context here, but I think in that paper that I was referring to, they talk about the fact that you need sort of 9 positives to outweigh 1 negative. So I always tell my students, if you're in a relationship and you really blow it,
start digging. Yeah.
9 really good things.
Wow.
To get it back in some kind of equilibrium. So
I guess that does prove it that bad is stronger than good.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
Yeah. And they have research from all different kinds of arenas to demonstrate. It's a really good paper.
Yeah. And I mean, again, there's an old adage, once bitten, twice shy. I mean, it's kind of that. It's, once bitten, 9 times shy, essentially. But it's not going to be a 1-for-1 thing. But that's probably a good ratio from a communications perspective. I just think there's so much opportunity. Like, look, we all have hotlines. We all have people that are doing workplace investigations. We all have this idea for what a moral or integrity-based culture is. Those are all things that we want in the economy that we're in now. But there's like this last mile, and I think it's a communication or a persuasion mile or whatever you want to call it, where we have to start plucking the heart and mind strings of the workforce at large in order to really start actualizing and elevating this function, which can really be a strategic lever in this new economy.
Agree.
So talk to me a little bit. I'm not going to quiz you and make you name all 8, but what are some of these moral disengagement factors or behaviors that you saw?
Okay, so one is, I can't remember exactly which ones we saw in the study because it's been a couple of years now, but I'll just tell you about some of them. So one I mentioned was attribution of blame. It's called attribution of blame. So, like in this case, blaming the customers and saying, look, it's on them, right? Mm-hmm. Another couple of them have to do with responsibility. So one is displacement of responsibility to an authority figure. So my boss made me do it kind of thing, right?
Got it.
Another is diffusion of responsibility, which is, well, that was a group decision. It really wasn't mine.
Yeah, we can't point to any individual. We are all kind of doing this. Yeah.
Right. Wasn't my play.
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah. Distortion of consequences is, this isn't really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things.
Interesting.
Yeah. Can't remember what this one is called, but we did it for a good reason. We're doing it
greater
for
good, the greater good fallacy or something.
Yeah. We're doing it for a good reason. There's one called dehumanization, which I don't think we saw, and it only applies in certain kinds of situations where maybe you're in a global, business ethics decision, and you, in fact, I had a speaker in my class yesterday who talked about something that happened early in his career where they were having to move these containers they were in Asia and they were having to move these containers up a mountain. And the only way to do it was having people like Sherpa type people
Like push it or something.
push it or carry it or whatever.
Yeah.
And people would die doing it. And he's looking at, a sheet of paper that's telling him how they're accounting for that. And it was $180 per human life.
Right.
Well, I think I might think about that as an example of dehumanization.
Yeah.
Because some beings are just not worth as much as others, right?
Yeah. Or you hear about like, oh, well, if this part fails, we're going to have like a X% incident rate, when incident means like deaths or something.
It means somebody died. So that's another one. You just used it, euphemistic language.
Got it.
Right. So using neutral language when what you're really talking about is ethically charged. So those are just a few of them.
It's so interesting. I mean, like nobody had to teach these students in your study. I mean, we're just kind of talking about like rationalizations. There's few things that are more efficient at rationalizing things than like the human mind, right? We can talk ourselves into things and we can say that's not that big of a deal. And it's interesting that they end up kind of like fractalizing all these different like approaches, kind of fractalize into these different buckets.
Well, yeah. And the other interesting thing about moral disengagement is that it was actually originally conceptualized as an individual difference that you can measure, and that some people are more inclined toward it than others. And that these 8 different mechanisms kind of hang together.
Interesting.
Yeah. And now it can also be situation dependent, which makes perfect sense, right? So if it's a situation where the boss told you to do something wrong, displacement of responsibility is the one that makes the most sense. But if you look at individuals and their propensity to morally disengage, you can relate that, and there have been multiple studies that have done this, you can relate that to a variety of unethical behavioral outcomes, cheating and those sorts of things.
You're saying that they cluster together and they tend to, there's like a coincidence of them.
Yeah, there's a correlation between having that trait, being high on that trait, and your inclination to behave unethically, to make unethical decisions, to cheat, to lie, those sorts of things.
Do you think any of those propensities end up mapping to, say, like certain of the big 5 personality aspects? If you were to guess?
There's now a model of the big 6.
Oh, what's this? What is the?
Yeah.
What's the
so
6th?
The sixth one, it's called the Hexaco model, and the 6th one is honesty, humility.
Interesting.
And so that's probably the one that comes closest.
Interesting.
There's another individual difference called moral identity, which you can also tie to ethical and unethical behavior. And that has to do with sort of how important being a moral person is to an individual, right, in their hierarchy of identities. So, I'm all sorts of things, right? I'm a professor and I'm a woman and I'm a wife and I'm, whatever. But how important in all of those identities is being a certain kind of ethical person. And so there are a variety of individual differences that you can look at. I have never found an organization willing to go that route, however.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, when I was doing a lot of research on ethical leadership quite a few years ago, I think it was the ethical leadership work. I was trying to get to do some research to see if we could, predict who is more likely to be an ethical leader, to become an ethical leader. And it makes sense to look at individual differences, right? And there was a real hesitancy to do that. It's just like, we don't want to label people.
Yeah, also I might not want to, I might not like what the test says,
Yeah, then what do I do? Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So
interesting. That's so interesting.
I have found organizations, well, they're very hesitant to let us do anything anymore, but particularly, I think, hesitant to look at any kind of individual difference, despite the fact that their organizations do these, they do personality inventories when they hire people. They do all this kind of stuff. But I think the ethics
is so interesting. I mean, that's such a
from that.
Yeah, it is. It seems like, it's definitely paradoxical, right? Like, it's not like you're introducing the idea of an assessment and they're like, we don't do assessments. Okay, here's a personality assessment. When they do other personality assessments, you just don't want to look under this rock?
Right, exactly. So, in the big five, there's conscientiousness, which is associated with deviance type behaviors. And now we have honesty, humility, which is associated with, ethical and unethical behaviors. There's another individual difference measure that she refers to as moral character. So there's a lot of them that one could use.
Right.
And you'd have to be careful, I think, how you use it. And especially now, people are desperate to just hire warm bodies. So I don't know.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's actually a good point.
But, there are other times when you could be more picky, and, it depends, depending on what kind of job you're putting someone into, right? You might want to be careful about putting someone into a position where they're totally unsupervised and, you're sending them to some foreign country where there's lots of, bribery. And,
right.
I could give you a list of things that you might want to test that person on that would help you make decisions about, where people might fit, at least to start, and then you can kind of see how they do and, follow them and kind of keep an eye on some people more than others, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of an interesting time that we're in, because there's all this sort of progress being made in your field and fields like yours. And then does it all fall flat because of the labor market? Do you know what I'm saying? And what are also I'm not saying your work falls flat, but I'm saying the speed with which we're able to implement them. What's the strong force, and also in terms of this great resignation that we're in, I'd love your opinion on this. It feels like the pebble or the rock has just been thrown into the pond. We don't really know what these longer term ramifications are. How do you see all this working together?
Well, let me just go back a moment and say that way before we had the Great Resignation, I saw a real hesitancy to use any of these tools.
Okay. Even when it was a hirer's market or something.
Oh yeah.
Got it.
They're just very hesitant. I think it has to do with the fact that lawyers run a lot of, these groups that we're talking about. They're just makes them nervous.
Interesting.
In terms of the Great Resignation, personally, get a little political here, I suppose, but I think we need to bring in a lot more immigrants. My goodness, Penn State is training all sorts of wonderful people from all over the world.
Yep.
And then they end up having a big hassle trying to stay here.
It's really crazy. It's a really crazy thing. The whole program's bizarre.
But I'm not just talking about at that, highly educated level. I'm talking about,
All
the
levels,
level,
yeah.
the level of the landscaper, the gardener, the housekeeper, or the person who takes care of your grandmother. My goodness, I mean, we are shooting ourselves in both feet all over the place. So I think, for a long time, people have said Americans don't want to do certain jobs, and I think it's true.
Yeah.
They don't. They're used to having a slightly cushier lifestyle. And, we've just been through a pandemic when people who were doing the essential jobs were taken advantage of. And, some of these people are just burned out. They've had it. I don't blame them. So,
yeah,
if they can get a job at, I don't know, Walmart instead of taking care of your grandmother, or working out in the hot sun, for the same amount of money, they're rational beings.
right.
So I think as a country, we need to get our head on straight about that. I think we should take as many Ukrainians as want to come. It just goes on and on. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things shake out and what new opportunities this all creates, right? I mean, the pandemic created a bunch of new normals in terms of people working from home and hybrid stuff that probably would have taken 10 years. We were able to condense down quicker. So maybe this great resignation or this great recalibration or whatever you want to call it is going to allow for a reprioritization of, jobs that folks can have, folks that can fill those jobs and so forth. Let me ask you, Linda, how did you get into this game? How did you get into the organizational behavior game? What is it about this whole thing that you spend so much of your time trying to figure out that really resonated deeply with you? And what's the opportunity that you've seen in it?
Yeah, so it's kind of a long story how I got into it. So I had been working, I had experience managing people. I found it fascinating. I kind of call it people being crazy at work. So I was interested in psychology, but, not wanting to be, a therapist or something like that. I was really interested in people, like I said, being crazy at work. So, because that's where we spend most of our time,
Right.
We spend a lot of time there. And so it took me a while to figure, I knew I wanted to get a PhD. I wasn't sure what in, and finally figured that out was going to be organizational behavior. And so I started that process, but then as a PhD student, you're trying to figure out, well, what's my niche going to be? What am I going to focus on? And I didn't really know, but I had to, as part of this program, I had never been to business school. I was a French language and literature major.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I had to get essentially a mini MBA along the way. And so I was taking a master's level organizational behavior class, and the professor made us write a paper. And so I was looking around for a topic, and I looked at the book, the chapters, and I thought, well, they already know everything about these things. That's not very interesting. But it was the 80s, and there were scandals all over the place. And so I thought, well, gee, I wonder if we know anything about why people behave this way, why they do this stuff. And so I went and asked the professor if I could try writing about that. And she said, sure, that sounds good. So I did. And I had very good library skills, and I did all kinds of research. And lo and behold, I found out that we hardly knew anything about that at that time.
Cool.
Very little.
Yeah.
So I wrote this paper and I turned it in, and that was that. And then I went, got my PhD at Texas A&M. I was living in Texas at the time. And the next class, one of the next classes that I took was a research design class. We had to design a study. Well, I didn't know anything yet and hadn't had any real content classes yet, except I'd had that master's level OB class, and I had written that paper. And so I said, well, maybe I can do something with this because I don't know anything else. So I did more research, and I came up with a paper and a design for a very simple research project. And the professor really liked it. And he wrote on there, I think this has potential. I actually think you could turn it into an Academy of Management Review article, which is, I know, this is my first semester in the PhD program. And
You're
so,
like, wow, this is pretty easy for me.
Well, it scared me. I didn't know what to do with it. So I went to him and talked to him, and an Academy of Management Review is our conceptual journal. So it's like, developing theory about it. And so I went home that summer because I was living in Galveston, Texas, and just, Texas A&M is on the west side of Houston. And I said, I'm going to work on this paper over the summer. And anyway, long story short, it used to be my most highly cited paper. It isn't anymore, but it's been cited thousands of times. And it is thought of as a paper that kind of launched this kind of social science perspective on ethical decision-making in organizations. And so that's part of the story. Later on, I had more of a personal insight, which is that, so my family narrative is that my parents were Holocaust survivors. And I grew up in a family that, my mother was only 7 years old when she came to this country. My father was a teenager. But, the families had lived through this. My grandfathers had both had very bad experiences, including one who was in a work camp, which is what they called them before the war. And so I grew up kind of wanting to know more about why people did bad things and why people did good things, because there were good people who helped people and tried to hide people. And so there was both sides. And I don't remember exactly when this popped into my head. I think I was writing the intro to my textbook. I actually decided I had to write a textbook because there wasn't a textbook I wanted to use to teach business ethics. I wanted to write it from a management perspective, not the philosophy perspective. And so I was writing, the introduction to that. And it just like a light bulb went on in my head. And I went, oh my gosh, I get it now. Why have I been motivated for 35 years, to study this stuff? Okay, I get it now. It took me a while. I mean, I could tell the other story, which makes sense, the steps that kind of led to, but it doesn't explain the motivation. It doesn't really
that sort of base root motivation. That's the strong force kind of behind all the integral steps or whatever that you can point to. It's that sort of gale force tailwind.
Yeah. So that's why I'm big on refugees. Help them any way you can. Yeah. Because if the U.S. hadn't taken my parents' families, I would not be here to have this conversation with you today.
My my dad was a Cuban refugee after Castro took over. So it's a similar, obviously it's not the Holocaust, but that thing of welcoming refugees with open arms is the basis of my family's entire sort of existence in this country.
Exactly. Yeah. And look at how wonderful we are.
See, this is like one of our best episodes ever. This would have never happened. So I love this conversation. I feel like you and I could probably keep talking for another, 2 hours. When you're looking at the sort of next 10 years, so here's my kind of theory. I think that there's a lot of vestigial structures that are overhangs from the Industrial Revolution, a lot of hierarchical organizational structures that don't really correspond or work with the knowledge work economy. Those perhaps work in organizing an army. Those perhaps work in having a bunch of people punching out, widgets on a big machine. But now, as exacerbated by the work from home and the new normal and all that stuff, we really are our work. And that is coinciding with this generational shift that's happening where the prioritizations are very different, right? My grandfather would tell me, housing always goes up, always put some extra money in your house. I saw friends and families' lives get shattered by the housing crisis, along with a dozen other bubbles that have sort of inflated and burst and so forth. And I think I'm not unique in my generation in feeling that like we're all going to have a hierarchy of like priorities. We're all going to have a hierarchy of values. And to the extent that those are different, they're going to largely be the same, but they're on a nuanced level. I think they're going to be different. And I think that's the basis for why a lot of these new generations are looked at by maybe people who are of a previous generation who are in positions of power in our organizations as like kind of weird or kind of crazy. And with the labor mobility where it is, the work from home where it is, there's no, like, it's not that surprising that this great resignation is happening and that this, there are people on my team literally that I've never met face to face, and they've been working with us for well over a year at this point, right? So that's not uncommon, whereas 5-10 years ago, no one could ever even like wrap their head around that. So all that I think is creating this really unique opportunity for people who are in an organizational ethics and compliance department or are in a sort of people first HR department to really be this strategic lever in their organizations if they can start taking a hold of some of the things that you're talking about and driving that culture forward. Because I think last century there was this big sort of separation and they were almost viewed as two different entities or two different things, the two things being the sort of external brand and the internal brand. The external brand is what's on the commercial, the internal brand is the sort of employee experience. Well, those are collapsed to like one sort of infinitesimally small like barrier, you know what I'm saying? It's one thing. And that, coupled with like the American dream is not being a millionaire. Most people in my generation don't even think that that's possible. It's having a purpose or, working in a place that you feel is doing good in the world. So it's like, there's all of these factors that are sort of kind of coming together that seems to create a little bit of a window here over the next maybe 5 or 10 years for organizations to really authentically, right? Because we are very well in tune to like inauthenticity and like social greenwashing or whatever you want to call it, to authentically grab hold of the stuff you're talking about to make our workplaces better. To your point, we spend so much time at work. Why not make them better? And then also, I think the new Ethisphere thing came out today or something, or maybe this week. And like the premium is up to like 24% now, the premium of like ethical companies versus non-ethical. So even for the myopic, like, pragmatic business person, whatever, that bottom line impact is meaningful. It's statistically significant and you can actually point to it. So I'd love for you to kind of react to this vision of this opportunity. I think that's that we're on the precipice of, and give us some wisdom that folks who are maybe listening to this can, breathe in and like put into practice in their organization.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm a little old-fashioned about what's possible, because I think that the senior leadership, especially the CEO, matters more than anything else. And if I were running an ethics and compliance operation and I didn't see the CEO as an ethical leader who was out there, really out there, I think I would try to find a different gig. So I like to call the CEO the Chief Ethics Officer. there's a lot you can delegate and have to because you're the CEO and you have a lot of other stuff to do. But people need to see you as representing the values of the organization every single day and everything you do, and talking about them and holding everybody accountable to them. And, you know, I was just reading, you probably read about this too, I mean, we're having some interesting things happening with politics and even the Ukraine war and organizations trying to figure out, you know, what they should do and how they should behave. But the example that I was thinking about was the CEO of Disney, who has put his foot in his mouth about 3 different times now in the last week or so about the Don't Say Gay law in Florida. So, I mean, they're really big in Florida. They've got Disney World. Mm-hmm. They have a ton of gay employees who they probably can't afford to lose. And they're, you know, supporting the political campaigns of the person who brought the Don't Say Gay law, the governor who's pushing the Don't Say Gay law, and these other people who are voting for I think they passed it. I don't know. Anyway, he could not seem to get the words right because
it was almost comically bad. Yeah,
it was comically bad. And, you know, his own employees are really angry, and I don't blame them. And so, you know, if you can't trust the CEO to stand for what you have, you know, on your website about your values, I don't think there's all that much you can really do. Now, you know, there are things you can do at a unit level to protect your people and try to create a nice ethical culture at that level, depending on, you know, how corrosive or toxic the big culture is. But honestly, I think it flows from the top. It needs to come from the center out. And then, you know, then everybody can work together, you know, to create an ethical culture that works and is aligned and all pushing in the same direction. So I'm really big on, you know, looking at CEOs very carefully, not just their ability to, you know, whatever they've done in the past to be able to make the numbers, because what we're seeing now is that everything they do is out there on social media. You can't.
Yeah, right. You can't hide anymore, right?
You can't be this quiet CEO who sits, you know, in the office and lets other people do these things. So, yeah. So that's a big one for me, is the leadership. And I'm also, I guess, Debbie Downer here, but I also think that I think we're going, obviously things have changed a lot, and we're going to see some permanent changes, and all of that is good. Or a lot of that is good, I guess, not all of it probably. But I've also heard people talk about the fact that there's a limit. So you say, you know, you've worked with people for a year and you haven't even met them, and, you know, they're all great. Mm-hmm. And it may depend on the people, but, you know, I know somebody who took a job like that, and after a year said, you know what, I need people.
100%. Yeah.
I need to see people.
It's not like to your point, it's not like there's no trade-offs. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot that ends up getting lost in the lack of translation, so to speak. Like, there's a lot of conversations that happen passing somebody in the hall or meeting by somebody's desk. And a lot of those those are all little threads in the sort of tapestry that is the culture of an organization. And
or
if the
over
only
lunch or in the break room
exactly,
or whatever.
or even on the
Yeah.
way to the washroom or walking into the car or out of the car, there's all those little conversations and all those little nodes in the network that can be, reinforcements of that culture and reestablishments of it that are really harder to sort of synthetically recreate via Zoom.
So the CEO came to my class yesterday. Was really interesting because he said, if you have a great culture, things can go great for 6 months, maybe even 12 months. He said by 18 months, he said, I saw things because they weren't traveling,
Totally.
all the things that they were doing before. He said it was starting to unravel. And he's a very astute guy and a very ethical guy. And he cares about the ethical culture of his organization. And, so he's traveling again. He's going and talking to people and interacting. And so I don't want people to get the idea that they don't have to do that.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, it's like everything in life. It seems like nothing grows on like this linear progression. It's, that saying, it happened little by little and all at once, or, the overnight success that took 20 years, or, everything is this sort of like logarithmic where it's approaching a limit and then it turns. That's how everything happens, it seems. And we just, as humans, can't seem to not think in these linear terms where, well, it wasn't that bad yesterday. How bad could tomorrow be? Well, all these different factors that we can't sort of account for can start to compound, and like, who knows whether this, great work from home experiment can actually sustain? Like, is it going to be 10 years from now and we're all in the metaverse meeting? Maybe the metaverse solved it. I don't know. But I just don't know how sustainable it is. But the fact of the matter is, private equity funds are buying companies after having never met leadership, which again, 5 years ago would have never happened. You know what I'm saying? People are hiring and working together.
Still a bad idea. It's still a
it
bad
may
idea.
be. It may be.
It's a bad idea.
All that management by walking around is gone. Not all of it. Obviously, there's people that are in office and stuff like that. But I'm saying largely there was so much of, and there's a large portion of the like population, to the extent that, half of the population are very objective, the other half are very subjective. And if assuming there's like an even distribution of those different sort of diametrically opposed personality types, there's a bunch of management by walking around, a bunch of vibe checks that aren't happening that can't be really gathered on a Zoom call or something like that,
Right. And I guess we don't know yet, what
did we just solve the Great Resignation? Did we just solve the cause? We just solved it together. I'm kidding.
I don't think so.
I'm kidding. This was really a lot of fun. Where can people find some of your famous papers? Where can they learn more about the work that you're doing and get in touch if they have questions?
Well, I'm easy to find. My email is ltrevino@psu.edu. So that's really simple. You can just stick my name in Google and whew, I'm right there. I can't hide. If you want to go to Google Scholar, I don't know if people use that, but scholar.google.com, put my name in, and I usually publish under my middle name is in there. So it's Linda Klebe, Kleb as in boy, E, Treviño, and or Linda K. And I've published over 90 articles, and I do have a textbook that is not a typical textbook. I do know ethics and compliance officers that have it on their shelf because it's called Managing Business Ethics, and there's a lot of the research that I've done and other people have done is really reviewed in there, but in a way that's accessible. So
business focused. Yeah.
So not just business focused, but, practitioner focused so that you can read, you don't have to read an article with all the statistics and all that stuff that people don't want to, have to digest. So I actually recommend that because it was just recently updated, and it's got a lot of the current research reviewed in there. And if you care to, you can look at the end of the chapter and see what the articles were. But you don't. I know my students don't do that. You don't have to do that.
And that book is called Managing Business Ethics, right?
Yep.
Awesome.
Managing Business Ethics is Treviño and Nelson, and it's available on Amazon. And the publisher is John Wiley.
Very cool.
Wiley.
Well, this was really a lot of fun. I feel like I learned a lot. Thanks for joining us and being so generous with your perspective and your time. And until next time.
Okay. Great talking to you. Bye-bye.
Likewise.